A very good morning to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICAN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. We will start the day with the story of the day. This story is about a farmer. So, a farmer was living in a village with his son, and he had only one horse. So, his neighbors used to say that he has only one horse. And one day, when he got up in the morning, he saw that the horse was also not there. So maybe it is stolen or something, and then the neighbors come and tell that, oh, it is very sad that your horse has been stolen. What happens the next day is the horse comes back with four more wild horses. So then the farmer is elated by seeing five horses together at his home, and then his neighbors come and say that, oh, it is so good that one turned out to be five now. So that's a great thing. So what happens next day? The farmer's son tries to tame one of these wild horses, but in the process, he injures his leg and he breaks the bone of his leg. So that time again, the neighbors come and tell, "Oh, it's so unfortunate. It's so bad that this thing happened to you." And then the very next day, some people from the armed forces they come touring all the villages and hunting for young boys who could be taken, who could be recruited into the army. So that was a compulsory recruitment drive by the army, and the conditions are going to be very difficult, and nobody wants to get into such things. So then they examine this boy who is the son of the farmer, and then they see that he has a broken leg. So they feel no, this person is not eligible, and they leave him. At that time, again, the neighbors come and tell that, oh, it's a good thing, whatever happened, because now your boy has been left. So, in essence, what the story tries to tell you is the first lesson from the story is never be worried about what people are going to tell you. So, even during UPSC preparation, many people may tell you many things, but we should not listen to all those things. I was once listening to Navjot Singh Sidhu saying, दुनिया में सबसे बड़ा रोग सोचना क्या कहेंगे लोग. So this is the biggest disease we have, is to listen to what everybody has to say and to decide upon ourselves based on what is others' opinion about us. So this is a very wrong thing to do. So never bother about the society. Do what you want to do. People will either way comment no matter what you do. So and the next important lesson that you draw from this story is that there are different perspectives about whatever happens to us. We may see something that's actually good, but we see it as a bad thing, and vice versa. So we never actually have a true picture why something happened today. You might be feeling it's a bad thing, but tomorrow you might feel that, oh, that actually happened for good. So it is very important to see something from multiple dimensions and multiple perspectives. So whatever happens, don't feel that, okay, worst luck has struck you and you're very unfortunate. It was a bad thing, a bad day, a bad life. So this is a wrong attitude to carry. Rather see the good things in everything. So even for a civil servant who has to solve so many problems in the field, so this seeing a particular problem from multiple perspectives is very important. So with this, we will start the day. First topic of the day, and today we have many topics to be covered, so we'll be a little quicker. So the first topic is the issues related to democracy. So there were 3 articles overall regarding what is happening now in Manipur. So a few days before we had seen what was happening in Rajasthan, so now the scene has shifted to Manipur. So in Manipur, it was the Biren Singh led government that was a ruling dispensation in Manipur. So this belongs to the BJP. It's a BJP led government. So now the crisis that has happened is that now this government is going to be in the minority. So basically the first thing, we'll look at the various issues that are now we can see from this episode. The first thing what has happened is when the elections to Manipur took place, Manipur has an assembly of 59 members. So out of which the party in power now got only 21 seats, while the opposition, the Congress, got some 26 or 28 seats. So accordingly, Congress was the single largest party which had to be called by the governor. But the governor called the current ruling dispensation to come and form the government with the help or with the support of the others. So here you can see an partisan role that is played by the governor. So this can be cited as an example when you are analyzing about governor. So any question on governor, You can use this example to analyze the controversial nature of the governor's office. So this is one application which you can use in the case of governor. The second thing that has happened is once the government was formed, the BJP then formed the government because it had only 21 members. So it took in members from other parties and also independents, and it formed the government. So these people from the other parties, they had defected and they joined BJP. So several defection applications were pending before the speaker. In fact, in one case, the defection of Mr. Shyam Kumar. So he has now become a minister and is a minister in the ruling cabinet now. So his disqualification petition is pending for 3 years, but the speaker of the assembly did not take any decision on this disqualification petition. So finally, it was the Supreme Court which had to intervene, and then it stripped this minister of all the posts and then banned him from entering the assembly. So only after the Supreme Court's intervention, the speaker disqualified Mr. Shyam Kumar. So this is a second issue which points towards the partisan role of the speaker. So speaker is supposed to play a non-partisan and impartial role in the conduct of business in the legislative assemblies. But this example shows how the speaker can play a partisan role. So this is the second issue, and whenever you are discussing about the role of speaker and the modifications that is needed, that is to be done, or the challenges or the issues related to the office of speaker, you can use this as an example. So this is the second issue that we have seen. The third issue that we see is, now in order to form the government, this government pulled up the other political parties and independents, and basically it was a coalition government that was formed. So out of 11 seats or so, 7 seats went on to the coalition partners, and the remaining were left with the party. So this way coalition governments are formed. But what happens in the case of coalition government is, now in this condition, for instance, one political party which had given support to the BJP is now withdrawing its support and is now supporting Congress. Similarly, the independent has now defected from BJP and is supporting the Congress. So basically what happens in a coalition government is, whenever coalition partners are taken, they will have to be given ministerial words. For instance, out of 11, 4 went to the coalition, 7 went to the coalition partners only. So they will have to be offered some SOPs so that they support the party. So in this case, ministerial words were given to these people from the coalition. But what happens now, this political party has withdrawn their support and the independent has also withdrawn the support. So these coalition governments are not really very stable. So they lead to unstable polity in a state. So that is the main issue of the coalition government. On the other hand, it is argued that coalition governments lead to cross-fertilization of ideas. So it will be more holistic, and different mandates of various political parties can be clubbed together. But in a sense, it can also lead to a lot of political instability in the state, because as we know that in politics, there is no permanent friend or permanent enemy. There are only permanent interests. And that interest is the interest in power. So as long as they want to be in the power, they can shift to any party. So the third issue that this highlights is the issue with the coalition governments. So you can have a question like, analyze the effectiveness of the coalition governments in India. So in that case also, you can use this as an example. The fourth thing is, when the BJP government was formed, many members from the Congress had defected. Similarly, now these political parties which were supporting the BJP are also now withdrawing their support, and there also now defections are happening. In spite of all this, the speaker is not taking up these defection requests that have been filed. So this shows the defects which are there in the anti-defection law itself. So as we saw in this case, the defection petition or the disqualification petition was pending for 3 years, and the speaker had not taken any action on that. So there is some inherent flaw in the anti-defection law, which does not set any timeline for the speaker within which the speaker has to decide on the disqualification petition. So this is one flaw with respect to anti-defection law, and this is the fourth area where you can use this particular example in anti-defection. So in this, I think Anti-Defection Act, we have already seen a critical analysis, its positives, negatives, everything we have discussed in detail about the Anti-Defection Act. So these were all the issues related to the Manipur Assembly. The latest thing being that now, because of so many defections that are happening from the ruling dispensation, Congress is now demanding a no confidence vote, and it has now support of those which were earlier supporting the BJP. So now it is looking to form the government, and it is asking for a no confidence motion in the state. So this has led to a lot of political instability. So now go to the next topic, which is the Korean peace process. So Korean peace process also we have already discussed in detail earlier, that what is a Korean conflict, what all measures have been taken, and what is the way forward, what needs to be done. So this is just an update on that. So in the recent news, the first thing is that North Korea and South Korea both have what is called as a joint liaison office. So this is there on the border, and what North Korea did was it had now blown up this joint liaison office at the border. So this is the first update. Second thing is that North Korea has also threatened that it will deploy some troops in the demilitarized zone. So in the demilitarized zone, North Korea has threatened that it will deploy the troops. So and also even in 2019, North Korea had also conducted some missile tests against its promise that it will be going for denuclearization. So in this regard, what had happened in before? So there was a Singapore summit, which we already know. We have spoken about it in the previous discussion on the Korean issue. So the Singapore summit was between the US President Donald Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. So in this also this summit did not bear much fruit, because there were differences between what United States wants and what North Korea wants. North Korea wants that the United States should remove all the sanctions that is been imposed on North Korea. But United States says that the sanctions will be removed only when there is a complete and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Only then it will remove the sanctions. But North Korea wants that it will start making efforts towards denuclearization, and when that is at the same time simultaneously sanctions have to be removed. But US insists only when there is complete and irreversible denuclearization, only then sanctions are going to be removed. So because of these differences, the Singapore summit also did not bear much fruit. And North Korea was also very apprehensive looking at the way US has been. So United States has this history of going after dictators of various countries in the past. For instance, in the case of Iraq, US went after Saddam Hussein. In the case of Libya, US went after Gaddafi. So like that, North Korea was very apprehensive that it might denuclearize, but then US may not remove sanctions. So that was the apprehension of North Korea. So because of this lack of trust between the two countries, nothing material actually happened. And also now United States has gone back on this P5+1 talks with Iran also. So you never know, today US might sign a deal and tomorrow it might just annul it. So this was lack of stability and lack of trust on part of North Korea and United States. So that was the biggest problem, that this whole summit did not give much benefit or did not lead to any material benefits. So North Korea therefore did not want to completely denuclearize because of this lack of trust. So in this case, what US and South Korea should have done was that they must have kept the talks on with North Korea and tried to convince it, and also possibly adopt that staged approach which North Korea has talked about, that simultaneously both has to be done. But South Korea and United States, rather, they went ahead with a joint military exercise also. So all of these further antagonized North Korea, and it further lost the trust in the talks with US and South Korea. So therefore, it even conducted a missile test, and now it has blown up the joint liaison office at the border. So this is the latest update related to the Korean conflict. And as I said, we have already covered this in detail. So the third topic we come is related to the India-China relations. So these were the 5 editorials which were there. Apart from the editorials, there were several other articles regarding the India-China relations. So we will see the most important ones or only those which are relevant for our exam. And the first thing that we'll be talking about is a power differential. One primary reason for this conflict that is happening between India and China is that China is aware of the power differential between India and China. So, Indian economy is definitely the world's fifth largest economy, but however, it is just one fifth the size of the Chinese economy. And China is completely aware of this power differential between India and China. So, that is why China knows that India is struggling to give an effective response to the Chinese, whatever it is doing in Ladakh. So that China knows, and because it is aware of this power differential that India will not be, or China has this perception that India will not be able to challenge China to that level because of this power differential. So that is one reason why China is attacking and maneuvering in the Ladakh region. So this power differential aspect is one important reason, and other reasons for the current escalation of conflict at the border we have already seen in detail. These reasons, 5 to 6 reasons for this escalation of conflict, we have already seen earlier. So this power differential is one more reason why there is this conflict. So the next is there was one more article on is 1960 a missed opportunity. So first you have to know what happened exactly in 1960 and why is it a missed opportunity. So on invitation of our Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in 1960, the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai had visited India. So by that time itself, we had a lot of issues with in the border. And so when Zhou Enlai came to India, he said that my main purpose of this visit or coming here is not to again provide arguments, but rather to discuss solutions to this problem. So by then this boundary problem was already there and he had come to discuss the solutions. So that time he had offered a plan to Jawaharlal Nehru. So the plan said that if India accepted China's claim of Aksai Chin, then China would accept India's claim on Arunachal Pradesh. So this was the two important things that China proposed that time, that India should accept Aksai Chin to be part of China and China will accept Arunachal Pradesh to be part of India. So this was the deal. So what it is said is that the first thing is whenever there is any international conflict, particularly border issue, so we always adopt a very hard stance that there is no one can interfere in the territorial sovereignty. So there is no way we are going to give away a part of our territory to some other country. But because of this hard stance, several of the border disputes they remain unresolved for centuries, and during that time these escalations will lead to loss of lives of many soldiers, and that is not good for both the countries. So it is better that rather than adopting a hard stance, it is better to come to a mutually compromisable solution where both the sides will have to do the give and take, and they finally come to a solution and resolve it permanently. So that's the most important thing. But this is also politically not a very favored option to go for this compromise, because public always feels that we should not lose our territory and government should protect our country and all that. So because of this, even Jawaharlal Nehru also felt that this will be against the public opinion, and he didn't accept Zhou Enlai's plan that India will recognize China's claim on Aksai Chin and China will recognize India's claim on Arunachal Pradesh. So this was not accepted by Jawaharlal Nehru, and this is considered to be a missed opportunity now. So why is this considered to be a missed opportunity? We will see that. So firstly, if this border issue was solved there, that time itself, the 1962 war itself would not have occurred. Secondly, these border issues would not have persisted for so long, and today in 2020, whatever escalation and the death of the loss of lives of soldiers is happening, that wouldn't have happened. The third thing is that this boundary problem, which today seems to be irresolvable, would have been resolved that time itself permanently. So there would have been a permanent resolution to the India-China boundary dispute. And the fourth thing and the most important thing that would have happened is that, in fact, as I told, this was a part of the settlement regarding Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. At that time, China had also proposed one more thing in that package. And China said that if India is ready to accept this package, then China will also accept India's sovereign claim on Jammu and Kashmir. So if India had accepted this whole plan, then China would have recognized our sovereignty over Jammu and Kashmir also. And today, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, our border issue with Pakistan, would also not have happened, and China would have acknowledged our sovereign territory as Jammu and Kashmir as our sovereign territory. So this also would have happened, and now this is not possible because China is very close to Pakistan now. But back then, China attached a lot of importance to India, more importance to India than Pakistan. So that's why it included in the package that it will recognize our sovereign claims over Jammu and Kashmir. So this was the fourth thing. So all these things would have happened had we accepted this package of China back in 1960 itself. But if you look at the present day, that is in 2020, if you see, first of all, there is again the death of soldiers that is happening, which is very unfortunate and tragic. Second thing, again, the boundary dispute seems to be irresolvable permanently. It is not going to be resolved anytime in future if we adopt this hard stance that we are not going to lose the territories. The third thing, now our claim over Jammu and Kashmir has also been weakened because of China's increasing support to Pakistan. So China is now definitely not going to support us that we have sovereign claims over Jammu and Kashmir. So this thing is again happening. And the next thing is, now either way, from the 1962 war, we did lose Aksai Chin. And now are we in a position to get back Aksai Chin? Or for that matter, even is China in a position to get Arunachal Pradesh from us? No. So by giving this argument, the article says that this 1960 was a missed opportunity for India. So the bottom line, however, is that India and China are neighbors, and this is not going to change. And we have to coexist peacefully with each other, and we have to harmonize our territorial claims. And that can happen only through mutual concessions. So that is the bottom line, and we have to be ready for some amount of concessions so that the border issue is resolved permanently and there is no further loss of lives at the border. So next is so in the recent times, after this incident of Ladakh, whatever happened in the Galwan Valley, there is a lot of public sentiment or anger, frustration that is leading many sections of people to suggest that India should ban trade with China. So this is like a punishment that India wants to inflict on China. So will such a trade ban with China work for India? So that we will be. So in this regard, the first thing is, this is basically a border dispute. So if the border dispute is allowed to transform into a trade war, that is not going to solve our border dispute. And this is also going to hurt India more than China. If you look at it from the economics point of view, Indian economy is already at a very weak point. So its GDP is under sharp contraction, and because of COVID also, there is a lot of slowdown that's happening in the economy. So if we put a trade ban with China, then that is going to hurt Indian economy more than the Chinese economy. So the economy is going to be hurt, Indian economy. Second thing, it is a border issue, and if you allow it to transform it into a trade ban, it is not going to resolve the border issue. So the border issue is going to remain unresolved. So this is the second important thing why the trade ban will not work. The third is that there are several segments in the Indian society who are dependent on these several Chinese goods because they are very affordable. For instance, pens or fridge, televisions, air conditioners, all of these are very cheap imports that India gets from China. So, and also the middle class in India is very price sensitive. So if they feel that the AC or the television is going to cost them some more thousands more, then they are not going to buy it. So now this middle class is able to afford all these things because they come at a cheaper rate from China. So if we stop buying these things from China, then we will have to get it from somewhere else, which will be more costly. So first thing is that it will be costly, and second is that our middle class will not be able to afford all these things. So that is one thing that our own consumers are going to be hit. So what our middle class could afford till yesterday, they would stop affording it and they would lose out on all these conveniences. So our consumers are going to be affected. This is the third important thing. Fourth is that these Chinese products, which when you go to the store, you see a lot of Chinese products. So the day when these products were brought into India, that day itself, the payment for these products were made already. So those products that are now in India have already been paid for. So if you are now going to a shop and you see a Chinese product, you decide not to buy, then you are basically you will be hurting the Indian retailers, because the day that product entered the Indian border only, it was paid. The Chinese people were already paid for that. So by banning it now, you are going to hit the Indian retailers. So the retailers are going to be affected if you ban it now, because these things have already been paid for. The next thing is that if you look at the imports that India gets from China, a majority of these imports are not the final consumer goods, but they are intermediate goods. So these intermediate goods may include some fertilizers or some electric machinery, etc. So the Indian manufacturers, that is the domestic manufacturers, get these intermediate goods and then they use it to form a final product which is then sold in India or exported. So basically these intermediary goods are used as raw materials in domestic manufacturing. So if we ban these intermediate goods, if we ban trade with China, so if we ban the intermediate goods, then it is going to affect these domestic industries only. So our domestic industries will all be hurt because of this measure. The sixth is that the basic premise between banning the trade with China is that we assume that if we ban trade with China, China is going to be hurt. But this is not true, because China's global trade is nearly $2,500 billion, and China's trade with India or our trade deficit with China is nearly $60 billion. So our trade deficit with China is just $60 billion, but China's global overall trade is nearly $2,500 billion. So this much amount of Chinese goods are exported every year. So you can see how insignificant an amount this $60 billion is, and that is why even if we ban trade with China, it is not going to affect China much. Rather, it is going to affect India more. So the seventh thing is, as we know that the imports from China are much cheaper. So if we are going to ban these imports from China, but India overnight cannot start manufacturing these things. It will definitely have to import it from somewhere else, if not China. But by importing it from somewhere else, it is going to be more expensive for us. So we will have to pay more to import the same goods from somewhere else, which means it is only going to increase our trade deficit. So if reducing the trade deficit is also our target, then banning imports from China and then importing the same things from some other countries is only going to increase our trade deficit. So increasing trade deficit can also prove counterproductive to our own economy. So this again will hurt our own economy. The next is, it has an effect on the foreign direct investment also. Because what the FDI investors look for is that there has to be some predictability or certainty in the policies of the government. So today there is a trade with some country and tomorrow you are banning the trade completely with that country. This shows how unpredictable the policies with respect to investments have become. So that is a big disincentive for the FDI investors who are looking to invest in India. They will feel that tomorrow this country can ban products from one more country. So therefore there is no predictability. So these FDI investors are going to see if the taxes are levied with a retrospective effect, or if the government is just cancelling the contract with us. So all of these things matter a lot to these FDI investors. So if they see such a policy environment where some sudden decisions of complete banning are being taken, then that is a huge negative, and that is a disincentive for these FDI investors who are looking to invest in India. And that is another thing. And then is that, as I said before, that several of the imports that we get from China are the intermediate goods. So we have several companies in India, for instance, the pharma companies, the telecom companies, or even the electronic companies. So they all depend upon the raw materials that China provides. For example, the pharmaceutical companies depend upon the active pharmaceutical ingredients imported from China. Same as the telecommunication equipments are imported from China. Then semiconductors and other electronics are imported from China to manufacture phone, laptops, and other electronic devices. So this way, if you see that all of these sectors are also now going to be affected. They are also employment providers. So this in turn again will affect our Indian manufacturing capabilities itself as a whole will be affected if we go for a trade ban. So these are the various arguments that are provided to argue that this trade ban with China to counter whatever happened in the Galvin Valley is not going to work, and it's going to harm India more than China. And now go to the next topic. So this is about the mental health issues, and the recent news being the suicide of the actor Sushant Singh Rajput, and this has brought to the forefront again the mental health issues which is often ignored in India. So in this we will analyze some of the issues which are related to the mental health. So now, particularly when the country is going through this crisis of COVID, so it has several mental health consequences. One may be a short term where you just feel the fear that you may also get the disease, or pata nahi who has that disease nearby you. What about your family members? What if they get? So this fear, sense of fear, all that is one more thing. Fear, panic, so all of these things which is leading to a lot of stress and mental trauma for a lot of people, but this is a short term thing. But what happens in the long term is what Nobel laureate describes as deaths of despair. So deaths of despair, so this term was given by the Nobel prize winning economist Angus Deaton. So what Angus Deaton says is that deaths of despair, so when disparity is so high, then it leads to deaths of people. So for instance, when the 2008 economic recession happened in the United States, after the recession, it was observed that the life expectancy of the working age Americans had actually reduced. So this is because after the recession, they were not able to find jobs. Then they became more frustrated and depressed. Suicide related incidences began to increase. Substance use incidences were increasing. Then there was more inequality in the society. And because of all this, there was people felt that in the future also they don't have good prospects for their progress, for their prosperity. So all of these things led to more suicides and substance abuse by the people, and they are going through depression and finally attempting suicides and all. So all of these things happened. So this is what is called as the deaths of despair. When future itself become so bleak to you, appears so bleak to you that you feel it is not worth living, so then people prefer to die. So that is the deaths of despair. So what this article argues is that now because of the COVID crisis, there is an economic recession in India. And the number of people who are suffering from this recession is also much more as compared to the United States in 2008. So these migrants who are lakhs of migrants who are now under so much of desperation, and similarly so many other people who have lost their jobs because of this COVID related economic crisis. So all of these things are there, and because of this in the future there could be deaths of despair. So that is why it is more important to now focus on the mental health, that a few years from now there could be some deaths of despair happening because of what happened today. So that is why it is extremely important to focus on mental health issues. Usually it happens that only when the celebrity suicides happen, the attention goes to the mental health, but after that it is very conveniently ignored. Should not happen. And even otherwise, the Indian scenario is also something that calls for an attention towards mental health. So in this case, 1/3 of a female, so nearly you can say 33% of female and nearly 25% of male suicide deaths in the world. So that is occurring in India. So 33% of female suicide deaths and 25% of male suicide deaths in the world, it is occurring in India. So this shows that the mental health is definitely something which requires much of attention it has to be drawn to this. So in this context, what should be the solution? So the first solution is definitely you have to have the trained psychologists and psychotherapists who are able to deliver these mental health interventions to the people. But there are two things associated with this kind of model. One thing is that these specialists are very less in number. And second thing is that for a majority of people, this will also become very unaffordable. So therefore, this model is not very, what do you say, it cannot suit the Indian context much. The second is that the telemedicine. So in the telemedicine also, even now several of these specialists are giving their services across geographical areas using the internet as a medium. But again, in this case, the digital literacy and the digital divide will pose a very huge hurdle so that these services do not reach the people. So digital literacy and digital divide pose a very big hurdle in reaching these in serving the remote people. So this model is again not very usable in India. So what we have to do in India is one model that has been done by Sangat. So Sangat is a leading innovator in the mental health sphere in India. So it has been able to deliver these mental health various psychological interventions that have been delivered to people who are in remote locations. And this the Sangat main thing that it has done is through the community health workers. So community health workers is a big strength that India has. For instance, the ASHA workers. So they can be a big asset when delivering these services to the people are concerned. So these community health workers, these community health providers could be trained in these interventions so that they are able to solve and understand the mental health issues that the population is facing at the local level. So this is a more sustainable mode of intervention that we can develop in India by training these community health workers. So that is a way forward for India, that these community health workers like Asha and Ashok, they can be trained in these psychological interventions so that they are able to deal with the mental health issues at the local level. So this is a way forward as far as the mental health issue is concerned. So next is let's see the kind of employment in the post-COVID world. So basically, it compares the nature of employment we have now with the nature of employment that is going to be there in the post-COVID world. So the current working environment is characterized by features like there is a fixed workplace where people go and work, and then there is also a fixed timings. So timings are also fixed. You are supposed to work in those timings. Then it is more like a person is associated with just one work, that is there is more of full-time employment these days that is happening. There is some amount of rigidity, there is not much flexibility or fluidity with respect to environment. So there are full-time workers, they have fixed timing, they go to a particular place to work. So all of these things characterize the current environment, but in the future this is not going to happen because of the COVID crisis. So what happens is earlier, because of these fixed timings and all, the gig economy, it felt, is very flexible and was in great demand. So in the gig economy, people worked part-time so that they could supplement their earnings. So for example, a worker could start riding Ola in the evenings as a part-time worker of Ola so that he can supplement his income from his work. So that was gig economy. So it was considered to be very flexible also. You can work part-time. Whenever you have time, you can work. So because of this, gig economy had become a huge success. But now if you look at the COVID scenario, you see that during the COVID, even Zomato, Ola, Uber, they have laid down so many workers. So because of this, the gig economy is again now under it is said that gig economy is not good because the workers here, they don't have any protection related to their health. That is, they have no social protection, there is no job guarantee. That is, it is based on the philosophy of hire and fire. You can fire them as and when you want. So now these companies started to face the heat because of the COVID crisis, so they just fired the workers. So there is no social protection, there is no regularity of salaries also, and they could be fired from the job anytime. So all of these led to the gig economy being considered not so good. But however, if you imagine a post-COVID world, this precisely is also going to become more important. Why? Because in the post-COVID world, now that the economy is only started to recover, many of the businesses may not have full-time work. So in that case, they will prefer some part-time work only. In that case, because of shrinking full-time jobs, there might be more part-time work, and the companies may go for specific assignment-based hiring. For instance, we could have a graphic designer who is working from home for a media house. We could have an artificial intelligence expert who is working with Netflix and is paid based on the number of hours the worker works. So there is going to be more assignment-based hiring that might happen in the post-COVID world. So the gig economy might again receive more importance. But as of now, the lack of social protection, lack of regular salaries, and lack of a job security has led even Raghuram Rajan to comment that this gig economy is actually was very attractive and looked everything wonderful. Everything looked so wonderful at once, but now it is looking more precarious. That means it is looking more risky now. So that was what that was a comment of Raghuram Rajan related to the gig economy. So, but now there could be assignment based hiring, specific hirings because of the scarcity in the full time employment after the post COVID crisis. So, because of all these things, you can see how the nature of the job is now changing. The environment is now more fluid, so there is more work from home. That nature is now developing, work from home nature is developing, and part-time worker, that nature is developing more now. And also the use of internet, mobile, and apps like Zoom and video conferencing, all of that things are happening. So there is definitely a change in the way we will be working in now and in the post-COVID world. So because of all this, then what the government should do? What is the role of the government? The first thing that the government should do is first is adopt a technology. So technology is a big savior. Even during the COVID crisis, many of us could work from home because of technology only. So this will enable us to have collaborative workplaces even when people are distantly located. So it offers more flexibility, and with that flexibility also increases productivity. So the first thing is it's very important to adopt a technology. And the second thing is now we saw that gig economy is important also because there won't be full-time employment. There will be shrinkage of full-time employment, and companies may go for assignment-based hiring. But we are also aware of the negatives of gig economy, that there is no pay security, there is no job security, no social protection and all that. So the next thing the government should do is to regulate this sector more. So regulate the labor policies in this gig economy so that the workers are not unduly harassed and their rights are being protected in the gig economy. So for this, another thing is that for the government role here is to bring about a regulatory framework for the gig economy. That is the second most important thing about the government's role. The third is the role of higher education. So whatever higher education we are emphasizing in the country presently is all pointed in the direction of white collar jobs only. So this also requires a recalibration. So in this, we also, apart from focusing on the white collar jobs, we also need to focus on the manufacturing sector. We also need to focus on vocational training. So all of these things will have to be done, and that is another important reform that the government needs to bring about in the future. So these are the important role that the government can play with respect to the changing job scenario in the post-COVID. So next we will see what is the related to UNSC reforms. So in this regard, the current news is that India has now been elected to the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member. So this is a very significant diplomatic victory for India also. And as being a non-permanent member of UNSC, what is India's mandate? The first thing that India will focus on is that the United Nations has several peacekeeping missions across the world. So these peacekeeping missions, several of these missions are present, but what is their mandate is also not properly clear. So there has to be more transparency in the mandate of these peacekeeping missions across the world. So that is one thing that India will be looking into. The second thing is India has always stood for this comprehensive convention on international terrorism, which was once sponsored by India, but it was not accepted. So now India is now going to look through this comprehensive convention on international terrorism. So that will be second focus point for India. The third is that UNSC reforms itself. The United Nations itself needs a lot of reforms. The situation of the world is not the same when United Nations was formed, and the world now is completely different. So UN itself requires more reforms. The United Nations Security Council, UNSC, needs to be expanded. So all of these reforms also India is going to look at. In fact, India has now formulated what is called as norms. So norms here means a new orientation for a reformed multilateral system. So a new orientation for a reformed multilateral system, or norms. So this was laid out by our external affairs minister S. Jaishankar. So India is going to follow this to be in the what reforms it is going to suggest as being the non-permanent member or as part of the United Nations Security Council. So this is very important, and also that India recognizes the fact that the United Nations Security Council that we currently have is not reflecting the 21st century realities. Because whatever issue is there, we have this among the 5 permanent members. There are first of all 5 permanent members. So now several countries have these 5 permanent members. Some of them have weakened, and several other countries have emerged much stronger. So the fact that we have 5 permanent members whose any vote is going to be a veto, so that itself is not the right thing. The second thing is that because of these 5 permanent members of Security Council, they have resisted several attempts for reforming the UNSC. Because one negative vote by any of these 5 permanent members is going to lead to the dropping of the entire resolution. So any resolution to reform the UNSC is defeated by these 5 permanent members. So that is why the reforms are very slow. They are not happening in this case. The second important thing is that among these 5 permanent members, the US is also there and China is also there. So now you can see any reform that is suggested, if it is supported by US, it won't be supported by China. If it is supported by China, it won't be supported by US. So because of this rivalry is also there. So, and in this COVID world, COVID-19, after that, you know that multilateralism is also going to shrink now. So in this case, India should play a very important role in opening fresh debates on how to strengthen multilateralism and how to strengthen multilateral institutions. So all of these is going to be a big challenge for India as a non-permanent member of UNSC. So this is all going to be on the India's agenda, and these are all will be our challenges in the UNSC. So now we'll be discussing yesterday's question. The question was, all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. It is Edmund Burke. So what I thought is, the other day I had given this as a quote of the day. So this is related to the part A of the ethics question paper. So we'll just elaborate on this today. And the reason I chose is the other day we have discussed a case study, and rather than taking up any GS related questions, which we even otherwise do take many a times, so I have taken this question. So whenever you are asked you are given a quote and you are asked to elaborate on that, the first thing, the structure of your answer should be, first you have to give an introduction, which should be a simpler way of explaining the quote itself. The second thing is you have to talk. Now let's say in this particular question, it is saying all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. So the next you have to tell why is it so, why the quote is saying so. In the intro you will just explain the quote itself in a simpler language. Next you will say why is it, and then you give a lot of examples to elaborate your answers, and then you have to give the application in the present context, and finally you give a conclusion. So this is the structure that I have followed in the exam. So in this case, let's see what should be the intro. So what is the question saying? It just says that in the society, if the society has to prosper, then good men, that is educated people, people who have strong values, they must have to fight the evil. Otherwise, the evils will always find ways to flourish. So that is a simpler way to express what is the meaning of the question. Next is we have to say why. Why means what? Why should good men stand up after all? So you have to give several arguments to support that yes, good men have to stand up. So one is what? One is that this world is full of evils and goods. That is, this world is full of black and whites. It's not just white. The black does exist, evil does exist. So just the fact that the evil exists is enough for the good men to stand and fight the evil. The second is that if the good doesn't fight the evil, then the good itself will be destroyed. So for instance, if there is corruption, and if you're not voicing out against corruption, then honesty, fairness will itself be destroyed, and corruption will be accepted as a part of the culture. So the third is that if the evil is not protested against, if the good men don't stand up against evil, then society is going to be more unstable, more chaotic. Then you can say that evil, whenever the path to the evil is always very easy, it is tempting, it is more rewarding, it happens in the short term. So for instance, it is very easy to lie, but it is very difficult to be honest. So taking the evil path is very easy. that is precisely another reason why good men should stand up and say that even though it looks easier, it should not be followed. So these are some of the arguments which you can pose as to why good man has to stand up. Then you will start with elaborating this with the help of examples. So examples can be, they can belong to any period. So you can say even during the freedom struggle, we had our social reformers, Rajaram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Vidyasagar, who fought against various evils, widow system, sati system, and all that. Then Ambedkar ji fought for the rights of Dalits. So now in the current scenario, I can talk about Kailash Satyarthi, who stood for the rights of the children, and he fought against the evil of child labor. Bezwada Wilson fought against the evil of manual scavenging. So like that, examples innumerable you can give to substantiate what arguments you have given. Next is you have to give an application in the present context. Why is it important to stand up against the evil? So in the present context, you have to give, for instance, it is important to protect the rights of the vulnerable sections like the tribals, the transgenders, etc. Then you can say that, for instance, even in the normal day-to-day life, if people are littering on the road, but we don't say anything because there is a chalta hai attitude. So from the smallest of things, if you observe, this attitude is definitely there even in today's world. So we have seen several honor killings that are taking place, rapes taking place, but then there are no witnesses for that. So this is happening even to this day. And even in the civil services, civil servants are seen as problem solvers in the society. So when they are seeing corruption in their office, for instance, they will have to stand against it. So that is the value that by doing so, they display the value of honesty and integrity. So this is very important. So then you write, that is the application in the present context. In the conclusion, what you have to write, see, in order for the good men to stand also, to stand against the evil, they also need to be provided a very conducive environment. If the good men are threatened, if they are killed, then definitely there is no incentive for them to stand against the evil. So for this, for the good people to be vocal, government and the society should give them an enabling environment to work and perform, to put their ideas in public and to support the cause. So they will have to be given that support. So through this, you can write as conclusion and conclude your answer. So today's question is, what is the importance of mental health? Analyze the government measures taken to improve the mental health. It's a 10-mark question for 150 words. And one more thing I have to tell is, this week in particular, I'll be traveling a lot. So I'm planning to upload the next video on Wednesday, combining Monday and Tuesday. And after that, also I'm still traveling till Sunday. I'll be traveling. So let me say, I'll update you on Wednesday when I'll be posting the next video. So the next video will be on Wednesday, which will combine the Monday and Tuesday newspapers. So this week, you all have to adjust a little bit because I'm completely traveling this week. So that's it for today. Thank you.